Life inside a tank. The Mark V tank. The arrival of the tank in World War I heralded a whole new kind of warfare that helped to break the bitter and bloody stalemate of trench warfare that had plagued the Western Front for years. And it was the British who pioneered the way in the introduction, development, and use of these fearsome armored fighting machines. They were first introduced during the Battle of the Somme in September 1916, much to the shock and disbelief of the German soldiers. These British main battle tanks were a series of heavy, so-called land ships that all had a very similar layout, with over 2,000 of them being built before the war had ended in November 1918. There were 5 main models, with the ultimate wartime one being the Mark V. This was introduced in July of 1918 and had been designed by Major W.G. Wilson, a British Royal Naval Air Service engineer, and produced at the Metropolitan Carriage and Wagon Factory at Saltley and Oldbury in the West Midlands of England. The Mark V tank was not a radical new design, just more of an updated version of the earlier Mark IV tank. 400 of these Mark Vs were built and consisted of 2 versions: the 6-pounder gun version, which was called the male variant, and the all-machine gun version, which was called the female variant. 200 of each were produced. The crew compartment. Like all the other tanks in the series, they were incredibly hot inside, cramped and noisy with very little ventilation. The crew of 8 were forced to communicate by shouting, using hand signals and writing notes to one another. To make matters worse, the Mark V had a serious design flaw, and that was the new engine layout, which meant that there was the constant threat of carbon monoxide poisoning throughout the tank from badly vented exhaust fumes. And it wasn't unusual for crew members to collapse unconscious inside the tank. The driver's cabin. The one revolutionary and unique feature of this new model was that it was controlled by just one driver, using a gearbox with 4 forward gears and 1 reverse gear. This was unlike earlier models that needed 4 gearmen, 2 to control each of the tank's tracks. This previously clumsy setup had led to much confusion when driving the tank, resulting in many mistakes and accidents. The Mark V's driver had just a small slit to see out of, so if the tank was not operating in battle conditions, the tank commander would often get out and walk in front of the vehicle, signaling to the driver where to go and pointing out any potential hazards. Sat next to the driver was a gunner who operated the forward-firing machine gun. Toilets and showers, or lack of them. Despite the tank being 26 feet or 8 meters long, there was simply not the space to install any kind of onboard toilet or washing facilities. And it didn't help that the tank was already woefully overloaded with all sorts of equipment and ordnance. So despite missions often lasting for days, all that was provided for the crew were some rags and buckets for washing and other bodily functions. To empty out one of the buckets, a crew member had to open the escape hatch to throw out its contents. But in the middle of combat, these waste-filled buckets would have to stay inside for hours at a time, adding to the stench of sweat and fumes in the poorly ventilated and hot interior. Dinner service. Often food like bacon and eggs could be cooked on board by being wrapped in tinfoil and placed on the top of the hot engines to slowly cook. But the ability to make the all-important cup of tea in a British tank didn't occur for another 30 years, with the introduction of the boiling vessel in the British Centurion tank, so the crew had to boil their water outside of the tank in makeshift petrol burners. The engine. The 29-ton tank was powered by a massive 19-liter 6-cylinder inline Ricardo petrol engine. The engine produced 150 horsepower, which is the equivalent to that of a modern-day Harley-Davidson motorcycle. This gave the Mark V a top speed of 5 miles an hour, about the same speed as that of a person walking briskly. Fuel tank. Despite holding 93 gallons or 420 liters of fuel, the tank only had a range of 45 miles. And though the fuel tank was armored, it could easily be penetrated by enemy heavy machine gun fire. As the tank was powered by petrol, it could explode when hit, setting the tank on fire, disabling it completely. So many crews were incinerated in this way that specially trained salvage crews had to be formed to retrieve their bodies out of the charred hulks. The starting handle. The tanks had to be crank-started internally using a large starting handle that had to be vigorously rotated with both hands in order to get the tank engine to start. The semaphore system. The semaphore system allowed for communication between tanks using a primitive signaling system of levers and discs on top of the tank, but this relied heavily on good visibility. Therefore, adverse weather conditions like rain or early morning fog made it next to useless. Battlefield smoke was also a problem too. The tanks also carried wicker baskets containing carrier pigeons that would have messages strapped to their legs and were released outside of the tank to fly back to base with messages. The armored exterior. The Mark V's armor had 16mm or 0.63-inch thick steel plate on the front, with 12mm or 0.47-inch on the sides, along with 8mm or 0.31-inch on both the rear and the roof. This meant that it was totally immune to all types of small arms fire, and it could also withstand heavy machine gun fire and grenade blasts on all but the rear and roof of the tank. The steel plate was just normal industrial grade and therefore quite brittle, so if the plate was penetrated, it was prone to splintering. If this happened, it resulted in small red-hot shards of metal shooting around the crew compartment with devastating effects. The crew would wear medieval-looking chainmail masks to protect their eyes, and gas masks were always close at hand. Weaponry. The male variant had a 6-pounder gun in each of the forward-facing portions of its sponsons, as well as a further 4 .303-inch machine guns scattered about the tank. One machine gun was located on each side of the sponsons, another facing backwards at the rear of the tank, and a fourth in the driver's cabin facing forward. The female variant was the same, except the 6-pounder were replaced with machine guns. The 6-pounders were a short-barreled version of a British naval gun, so they didn't get stuck in the mud as they crossed the trenches or shell craters. The machine guns were the Hotchkiss M1909, which could fire as many as 10 rounds a second in short bursts. But the drawback was that the odor from the cordite propellant used in the machine gun's rounds, though smokeless, caused irritation to the eyes and lungs of the gunners inside the cramped and poorly ventilated interior of the tank. Ammunition. The 207 rounds for the 6-pounder gun was centrally stored, whereas the thousands of rounds for the machine guns were distributed about the tank next to the weapon ports for quick and easy access. The side sponsons. Turrets for tanks had yet to be fully realized, therefore sponsons were used at first. There was one located on either side of the Mark V tank. Each housed 2 weapons, one in the front of the sponson that had a very limited arc of fire and could only fire at targets in front of the tank. The other was on the side of the sponson and could only fire at targets to the side of the tank. Depending on the variant, the gun facing forward would be a 6-pounder gun on the male version or a machine gun on the female one. The side-facing gun on both variants was always a machine gun. After the war, these clumsy types of mountings were discarded as designers introduced more effective turreted designs. But a notable exception was the U.S. stopgap tank of World War II, the M3 Lee Grant. Observation post. An armored cabin on the roof of the tank was used for all-around observation, using a series of observation slits. There was also a peephole on both sides which the commander could also fire his 6-shot service revolver through if he needed to. These tanks were reasonably successful, though after the war they were gradually phased out of service to be replaced with new tanks that had gun turrets and smaller crew numbers and proper dedicated suspension, like the Vickers Medium Mark II, that were also equipped with radios. Some Mark Vs were used in the Russian Civil War that ended in 1920. The last recorded use of them was in August 1941, when the Red Army used 4 of them as dug-in fortifications during the defense of Tallinn against the German invaders. Cross-section of the A7V tank. One of the most iconic visual elements of the Second World War are German panzers blitzing their way across enemy territory, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. During the First World War, German tanks had a less than auspicious start. Their first attempt at a tank design was the A7V, a clunky metal box on tracks, a far cry from the formidable vehicles a quarter of a century later. In 1916, the Entente powers introduced the first tanks, hoping to break the long stalemate of the Western Front. Though limited, the success of the French and British tanks made it clear to the world that a new method of warfare had begun. Despite this, the German High Command was hesitant in adopting their own armored vehicles, and as late as 1917 were still relying on artillery and especially infantry, utilizing new stormtrooper tactics to break the stalemate. Undeterred by all of this, Germany did have some forward-thinking planners, and in May of 1917 the final prototype of the A7V, designed by Joseph Vollmer, was tested. After some modifications, production began in October, with the first A7Vs arriving at the front in March of 1918. The tank was named the A7V after Abteilung 7 Verkehrswesen, or General War Department Section 7, Transportation. The initial plan was to produce 100 A7Vs, though only 20 were actually made before the end of hostilities in November 1918. While plans were drawn up for other tank variants, none of these made it to the production line before the war's end, making the A7V the only tank that Germany actually produced. The vehicle was designated the Sturmpanzer Kraftwagen, or Assault Armored Motor Vehicle. Crew compartment. The A7V had a much larger crew than its French and British counterparts, usually 18 men. These consisted of an officer, driver, mechanic, signaler, and 12 or more infantrymen to operate the vehicle's 6 machine guns. There were also 2 artillerymen on board to operate and load the cannon at the front. Sometimes they managed to squeeze up to 25 men inside the tank, mainly on the female variant. The inside of the A7V was a simple open space with no compartmentalization to separate the different sections. The engines were located in the center of the tank, with the officer and driver sitting above it, viewing the world through a cupola. Both these men wore asbestos-impregnated suits to protect them against the immense heat generated by the engines. The outside world was observed by small slits that provided limited visibility. The tank would be forced to make frequent stops as the commander reoriented himself. The rest of the crew operated the multiple weapons of the tank, including the main 57mm gun and 6 machine guns. Conditions in the vehicle were hellish, being extremely hot and cramped, and petrol fumes permeating the atmosphere. Crew members would often ride on the outside of the tank when not in combat to escape the discomfort. Access to the vehicle came from several rectangular hatches along the side of the tank. Weapons. The main armament of the male variant A7V was a bow-mounted 57mm field gun. A typical ordnance load consisted of about 180 rounds, divided between high explosive, canister, and standard munitions. Around the outside of the hull were located the 6 Maxim MG08 7.92 by 57mm machine guns, 2 on each side and a pair at the rear of the machine. Each tank would carry around 50 to 60 belts of machine gun ammunition, each belt containing 250 rounds. Though this was the standard armament, this could be adjusted based on circumstances. For example, one tank was modified into a female or all-machine gun variant, the 57mm gun replaced by a pair of Maxim machine guns. Each of the weapons was fixed in place, as the idea of a rotating turret had not been thought about by German engineers yet. As a result, each piece was constrained by a limited firing arc, especially the bow-mounted field gun. In order to bring this weapon to bear, the entire tank had to be shuffled about, which was a slow and cumbersome process. Armor. The armor of the A7V varied, being around 30mm thick at the front and 20mm at the sides. The top and underbelly of the tank was made of the weakest armor, a little over 10mm, thin enough to be penetrated by fragmentation grenades. The metal was also just regular steel, which was brittle. Even if a hit from enemy fire was deflected, the crew inside would be showered with fragments of metal. Names and artwork. Each A7V was christened by its new crew and was given a unique name. Some were given women's names like Gretchen or Lottie. Others were named after mythological heroes such as Wotan, Hercules, and Siegfried. The only surviving A7V is number 506, named Mephisto, short for Mephistopheles, a demon in Germanic folklore, associated with the character Faust, which incidentally was another named tank, number 503. Before entering battle, the crews would paint artwork on the vehicle. The Mephisto featured a red demon holding a white rhomboid, resembling the profile view of a British tank. Many of the tanks also had a skull and crossbones painted on the bow, but these would be painted over by a black and white cross patty, or German cross. After its capture, Mephisto would be repainted with a crowned British lion with its paw over an A7V. Engine. The A7V was propelled by a pair of Daimler-Benz four-cylinder petrol engines located in the center of the vehicle for a combined 200 horsepower performance. Two engines were used since there was no single engine large enough to power what would fit into the limited space of the tank's hull. These propelled the tank at around 9 miles per hour on roadways, though this was reduced to around 3 miles per hour on uneven terrain. Like its contemporaries, the A7V rode on Caterpillar tracks, increasing its traction. One advantage the tank had over the Entente designs was the armored plating of the vehicle, which covered the tracks, reducing their vulnerability to enemy fire. Fuel tank. The tank had a fuel capacity of 500 liters, or 132 gallons. Due to the engine's rapid consumption of fuel, this limited the range of the A7V to 60 kilometers, or 37.3 miles on flat roadways. Dimensions. The A7V measured in at 7.34 meters in length, or 24 feet, 3.1 meters or 10 feet wide, and 3.3 meters or just shy of 11 feet in height. They weighed in between 30 and 33 tons, and this variation was due to the manufacturing process, with each tank being made by hand with no standardization, leading to small changes between each vehicle. The boxy design was reminiscent of an armored railway car, though capable of movement under its own power. Chassis and suspension. The A7V was designed around the Holt tractor chassis, including a suspension of vertical springs. Due to the immense weight of the vehicle, the tank had a very low ground clearance, limiting its operations to roadways and flat, even terrain. In spite of the suspension, the ride was a bumpy one, and ropes were suspended on the roof of the tank for the men to grab onto and steady themselves when traveling over difficult ground. A7V in action. The A7V saw limited action during the war. The first operation was in March of 1918. There, the tanks were utilized in the spring offensive at St. Quentin. Two of the vehicles broke down before the engagement started, but the remaining A7Vs managed to help repel a British counterattack. On April 24, 1918, a trio of A7Vs were being used in support of an infantry assault at the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, when they encountered 3 British Mark IV tanks, 2 of which were female variants, which just had machine guns, and a male variant which was equipped with 2 6-pounder cannons. During the fight, the British female tanks' machine guns were totally ineffective against the A7V, and so they withdrew. The male tank remained and scored several hits on an A7V, disabling the vehicle, and its crew were forced to abandon it. This was the end result of the first ever tank duel in history. It was during this action that the Mephisto became trapped in a shell crater. Unable to extract itself, the crew abandoned the tank, which was later recovered by the British. It would eventually be transported to Australia, where it still resides today as a trophy and a museum piece. After its poor performance at Villers-Bretonneux, German High Command removed the A7V from active service, and the orders for 100 more vehicles were cancelled. The surviving vehicles would see limited service for the remaining months of the war, though the bulk of Germany's armored forces would consist of captured British and French tanks. After the war, most of the remaining tanks would be scrapped. In spite of the A7V's limited success, it wouldn't be the last tank in Germany's arsenal. Later German tank designs would incorporate the lessons learned from the Great War, leading to the development of some of the most famous and effective tanks ever built.